My guest at this time is Jarrett Stepman. Jarrett is a contributor for the Daily Signal, which is affiliated with the Heritage Foundation in Washington. As Columbus Day arrives on the calendar once again, the controversy over his legacy also continues. Columbus critics claim he's an historical villain who exploited indigenous people in North America and ushered in an era of grotesque colonial oppression. This year, the city of Columbus, Ohio, announced it will not observe the holiday, claiming it wanted to commemorate Veterans Day and could not afford to do both. Columbus defenders say he was not perfect, but embodies many qualities that are worth admiring, and that it's unfair to judge him on societal standards 500 years apart from when he lived. So, what is the full story on Columbus, and is he still worthy of being honored each year? And Jarrett, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, you wrote a column actually published last year for the Daily Signal that I think sheds a lot of light that many people are missing on the Columbus legacy, and we'll get to some of that in just a moment. I can remember back in the 1980s when there seemed to be really no controversy whatsoever over Christopher Columbus. Most people didn't really make a big deal about the holiday, but he certainly wasn't a controversial figure. But that all seems to have changed in the past couple of decades. When did this anti-Columbus movement get going, and why?
Absolutely. It did start to change. It really started in academia in the 1970s, and that's, I think, when there really was a big transition happening, especially this one academic named Howard Zinn, who was very much influenced by Marxist ideas and ideology. And, in fact, Marx and Engels also wrote some very early attacks on Christopher Columbus. But this kind of steamrolled into especially the 1990s. 1992 was kind of a big year in which the city of Berkeley actually had the first what's called Indigenous Peoples Day, based on the 500-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus coming to America. But even at that time, it was really just a scattered few people who were attacking Columbus. Most Americans, as we have through most of our civilization's history, celebrated Columbus. Textbooks and history school books mostly taught that Columbus was the father of the Americas in many sense, that he had been a great explorer and that he was somebody worth celebrating. And that really started to change. And for the most part, in the last 20, 30 years, it's gotten much, much worse until you have today where you have statues coming down, where you have people attacking Columbus very frequently. And so there's kind of been a snowball effect in which Columbus, who used to be universally admired, is universally attacked or simply dismissed as a bad person that we should kind of do away with and just kind of let disappear from the American pantheon.
And like I just mentioned, and as I'm sure you know, Columbus, Ohio now, which is obviously named after Christopher Columbus, not bothering to commemorate the day in any way, not even observing Columbus Day there. So this doesn't seem to be a fringe idea anymore. It might have started there, but it's not there anymore. What's responsible for it growing so widely, do you think?
Well, I mean, yes, and it's even more extensive than that when you think our nation's capital, the District of Columbia, was named after Christopher Columbus. I mean, Americans in the founding generation admired him very much, very widely. And I think that now, especially, I mean, you have so many attacks on America's past. It really isn't just Columbus right now. You have different attacks on many different statues and these sorts of things happening. Columbus is kind of getting swept into this, which I think it's very unfortunate because at one time, Columbus he didn't just stand for the New World. In many ways, he stood for immigrants. He stood for the fact that most people in America came from other parts of the world at one point, and Columbus was very much a symbol of that, a man who kind of bridged the gap between the old world and the new world. The founders liked him because he stood for science, he stood for discovery, he stood for what America would become. It was a very hopeful figure, and I think that's why he became such a widely popular figure in America, because he kind of represented what the civilization wanted to be. I mean, he's this forward-looking individual who stands for bold discovery, who stands for pushing the boundaries. I mean, this is what kind of America's about. When you think of a man going to the moon, I mean, that is the spirit of Columbus, and I think there are a lot of people, especially in modern society, especially on the very far left, who don't like the kind of seeds of American civilization. They think it's kind of rotten to the core. They think the root and branch, it needs to be just pulled up and we need to start again. And I think that's a very wrong way to look at this. I think it's very destructive, especially understandably. I mean, of course, a man in 1492 has a very different look on the world. It was a more violent time. It was a more brutal time. But the reason why we have things so good today, the reason why we've built so much, is because of people like Columbus. In many ways, these people stood out in their own times and created something new and something better. We should be thankful for that. We should celebrate that. We don't have to be just like those people. We should accept the fact that they created good things that have made us who we are, and we should be looking to the future the same way that Columbus did.
Is there anything about the adventure aspect of this, the daring enterprise, that is looked down upon, or is it mainly his interaction with the indigenous peoples?
I think that's a large part of it. I think his bold action is simply dismissed or ignored. I think people don't care that. I mean, when you really think of what Columbus did in his journey, I mean, it's unbelievable to imagine now. The ships that he sailed in on, even this biggest ship, was only about 60 feet long. I mean, these were basically what you think is modern circumstances boats that he crossed the Atlantic, and he really crossed into the total unknown. I mean, put yourself in his shoes. Put yourself in the shoes of his crew. They had no idea what they were going to experience heading out into the Atlantic. Nobody had done this before. He did this on 3 ships. He did this with a sometimes mutinous crew that wasn't always favorable to him, and he went through incredible hardship, and that really requires really an incredible foresight and boldness. I mean, don't we want a future Americans to have that kind of boldness that Columbus discovered? I think for many they just kind of gloss over that. I mean, he's an easy villain to point out, for ideological reasons. But there's something to be said about what he did, the exact experiences of his journey. And if the listeners haven't read through any of his accounts in his journal, which he did take down, they're absolutely incredible. The things that he experienced and he saw. This is a bold man that I think everybody, certainly Americans throughout the Americas, not just the United States, but through the South American, Central American countries, have reason to celebrate this and say that this is the father of the Americas, the man who created this kind of world because of his bold discovery, and that's a good thing that we should still celebrate.
Let's get into some of the other stuff now. Columbus is viewed by many critics, of course, as someone willing to rape and pillage to extract every ounce of valuable resources he could, regardless of the impact on the indigenous people. But what was his real motivation? You wrote about this quite a bit in your story.
Yes, and I think this is something that's very much glossed over. And certainly he did have a desire for gold, but Christopher Columbus was a devoutly religious individual, and at the time, the church was having a lot of problems. The Constantinople had fallen, and for many Christians, especially in Europe at the time, they wanted to spread Christianity. Columbus's case, he wanted to spread it to Asia, which is where he thought he was going. The reason he did this is because, even his name, Christopher is named after a saint, the Christ bearer, who bore Christ across the water, and he saw his mission as primarily a religious one. I mean, he was a man who wanted the recognition for what he did, but he wanted to spread his religion. He wanted to spread Christianity. He wasn't just a man driven entirely by greed and driven by these things. He was an explorer who wanted to bring his religion, and he wanted to save souls in a new land. And that is the primary motivation of Columbus. It gets glossed over today because, we kind of go to the economic arguments and things like this, but in the world that Columbus lived in, this was the primary importance of his journey for him, and I think that's often overlooked in these debates. We're
talking with Jarrett Stepman, contributor for the Daily Signal. He wrote a column last year on why Columbus ought to be appreciated. Jarrett, you've talked about these last couple questions a little bit already, but I just want to dive a little deeper. First of all, how was Columbus thought of in his own time?
Well, Columbus was in some ways celebrated, but he also had some detractors. And I think that's a lot of the modern accounts that say, we found a history that attacks Columbus. He got somewhat unpopular with the Spanish authorities because in many ways he was an outsider. He was originally an Italian, and many of the conquistador Spanish kind of wanted to get him out of the way for political reasons. So he did get a lot of attacks in his own day, which have kind of created some of the negative Columbus perception. But in some ways, I think it's kind of sad because we now have these modern accounts that Columbus was particularly brutal, when the reason he was deposed as governor there in the New World is because he wasn't brutal enough, because the Spanish authorities were upset that he went after some of the Spanish who had abused natives in the New World. Columbus didn't want this. He thought that many of the people he met were peaceful, good people, and he actually punished many of them, which got him into hot water, and where a lot of the attacks on him came from. So I think Columbus was not necessarily the greatest governor of the New World, but he was a great explorer. And I think his reputation only started to grow in the centuries after, when people started to appreciate exactly the depth of what he had accomplished. And certainly that the founding fathers in particular glommed onto Columbus when a lot more information about his journey started to come out. They really embraced him as the kind of symbol of the new world, of this new nation. I think he's especially important in the United States because of how our civilization treated Columbus when a lot of the information about his journey came out. And that's an important thing.
Lastly, and you've talked about this already, you talked about how much more brutal the world was 500 years ago. But what do you think's fair and what's not fair to judge him on now?
Well, I think Columbus certainly did make mistakes, and he could be brutal. He did occasionally enslave some natives, although they were usually the violent ones. There were actually many different tribes he dealt with in the New World. A lot of the criticism, I think, we take out of context. I mean, it was a more brutal time for anybody. I mean, the system that they had, which was kind of a feudalism, existed in Spain and existed throughout Europe. It existed in the New World, and it was kind of implanted there along with him. You know, I think it's fair enough that we today are against things like feudalism, but it was essentially what was universally accepted in his own day. In fact, those who attacked him over the issue of slavery simply didn't like that he was enslaving particular people. They wanted him to enslave some other people. So I think we lose context given the fact that we live in the 21st century, and a lot of these negative things have been done away with, very fortunately. And I would say it is in large part because of Columbus's discoveries, because of the growth of the United States and its development thereafter. So I think it's fair to say that people in our past are not perfect and they do not embrace the norms that we have today, but they led to many of the good things that we have today, and that's what should be celebrated. Instead of trying to comb through and find everything terrible about people, we should accept the fact that maybe they weren't perfect, maybe they weren't exactly how we'd expect a person to behave in the 21st century, but that's okay. This is why we're here. This is why we are who we are today, and I think that's an important distinction.
This is just a couple of quick closing thoughts here. First of all, we're at the point now, and I'm sure you've seen it on social media, where you've got famous people apologizing for quoting Winston Churchill now. So Columbus is not alone in this category. And ultimately, you think Columbus would be the ultimate bipartisan adventure here, because you talked about the daring individualism of the project, but it was all funded by the Spanish government. So everybody should be happy.
And they should be. And it is interesting because, I mean, even in the early 20th century, the only groups that were really attacking Columbus, interestingly enough, were some white nationalist groups who didn't like him because he was unacceptably Catholic and he was Italian. He stood for immigrants. And it's interesting to hear a lot of the arguments today mirror those arguments that ultimately Americans mostly rejected. I mean, they mostly embraced this man as a symbol of their civilization. It's interesting to see these attacks kind of wrap in on themselves today on Christopher Columbus. And I think, you know, it's gotten so ridiculous. We've gone down so many rabbit holes with individuals of our past and tried to destroy them. I think that's wrong. You know, we should celebrate these people, and we should believe in an America in which we can continue to build statues to more great individuals, more people who are bold and daring, and have accomplished great things in our time. And I think if we're destroying the past, we're really wiping out our future too. I think we'll be a nation with no past and no future, and I think that's a very dangerous moment in this country's history, and I think it's an unfortunate one.
That's a powerful way to sum it up. Jarrett, thank you very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Jarrett Stepman is a contributor for the Daily Signal, which is affiliated with the Heritage Foundation in Washington. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.